So in the Western philosophical tradition, and that is what I am schooled in, so I will only talk about the Western philosophical tradition. That's where my expertise is. There's four major approaches to ethical deliberation, and basically those approaches can fall into like two or more groups. But for the purposes of today, two groups. One of them is consequentialist theories, and one of them is non-consequentialist theories. Right? So consequentialist theories are theories that say that the right thing to do is the thing that will result in the best consequences. You want to know what the right thing is? Figure out what's going to generate the best consequences and do that thing. But now you're left with the question, right? Well, then how do I determine what best consequences means, right? You could answer that in lots of different ways. And so here comes one of the more prominent theories in Western ethics, which is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism started off with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And they were looking for a way to make ethics more like a science because they noticed that in their time that a lot of ethical decision making was being made on the basis of sort of bias and bias, frankly, right? And those, sort of making decisions that were not reflective of taking other people's interests very seriously. So, no worries, folks. If you can't have your camera on, no problem at all. I just figured I'd invite those who do have cameras that they can turn on and have on. Otherwise, you're so welcome to be here with or without camera. Okay, so utilitarianism comes along and they say, here's how you determine what the best consequences for all concerned are. You maximize happiness and you minimize suffering for all concerned. So you are calculating the consequences or potential consequences as you understand them of whatever course of action will be taken. And you choose the course of action that's going to result in the best consequences overall. So the one that maximizes happiness for the most people. So that's what you do. So if you want to know whether to lie about why you can't go to the movies with your friend, so you say you made plans. I made plans with Roberta to go to the movies. And I'm sorry, Roberta, I'm going to come off as real petty in this example. But I made plans to go to the movies with Roberta. I said I would go. I promised. And then it turns out just a better offer came along. Someone had tickets to see Bruce Springsteen. I'm from New Jersey. You cannot say no to Bruce Springsteen tickets. And now I need to tell Roberta I'm not going to go to the movie. So what's the best thing for me to do? Well, I have to, according to utilitarianism, sort of run a calculation on how much pain and suffering I will cause by telling the truth versus lying. Right? And so I try to figure out what would be the consequences of me telling Roberta the truth. What would be the consequences of me lying to Roberta and saying, oh, I got a terrible cold. I'm so sorry I can't go to the movies with you. Versus, hey, Roberta, sorry, but I got tickets to Bruce Springsteen and that's it. Like I'm just not going to keep my commitment to you because the boss is involved. So I try to calculate, right, how much hurt would be generated by telling the truth, how much hurt would be generated by telling a lie. I try to think about the potential long-term impact on the friendship of telling the truth or telling a lie. I try to add up all these things. And then after I've added them up and done my kind of calculations, I'll know what the right thing to do is, because I'll know what will maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And so maybe it turns out that Roberta hates Bruce Springsteen, would never understand why I would ditch her to see a Springsteen concert, what have you. Plus it's Roberta's birthday, all the business. And maybe it would turn out that lying would be better overall, better consequences for all concerned. Is that making sense? So far, doing okay? Okay. So always with moral theories, you want to ask yourself, who matters on the view? So it's not just what does it tell you to do, but who actually is the object of moral consideration? Who do we owe morality to? And utilitarianism was really the first of its kind in Western theory to say, you know, who matters morally is any sentient creature. Any creature with the capacity for feeling pain and pleasure counts morally. This is very different from other ethical theories. Like when I talk in just a minute about Kantian ethics, you'll see it's really different. So on the utilitarian view, animals, for example, are to be morally considerable when you take calculations. So if I'm trying to figure out if I should knock down my house and build a new house, I need to think about my neighbors, the environment, and all the animals who live around my house also, right? Because they are capable of pain and pleasure, so they get put into the calculations that I'm running. That was like revolutionary at its time, right? Nobody was really thinking about animals and owing moral consideration to animals. So that's the consequentialist theory that we'll think about a little. Oh, I got to go faster. This is taking me too long. Okay. Let me ask you this. Are you okay with this pace? Would you rather I just take a little longer, even though he'll cut into discussion a bit? I can't tell. Yeah, Daniela. Oh, nope. I thought your hand was up.
Yeah, no, I just want to do the thumb up, like I'm okay with this pace.
Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to talk through just a few of the non-consequentialist views. And so those are moral views that aim at some other moral ideal than generating the best consequences. So whereas utilitarianism is going to tell you do the thing that maximizes happiness and minimizes pain, and you're looking for the best consequences, meaning the thing that will maximize happiness or pleasure, these theories don't really aim at consequences at all. So the most probably well-known example of that kind of a theory is Kantian ethics. And Kantian ethics falls into a school of ethics called, we call them, I'm just going to pop it in the chat, deontological ethics. And that just means that they're duty-based. They're an ethics that takes thinking about duty as central to the moral life. So you're not thinking about consequences here, you're thinking about duty and obligation. So in Kantian ethics, you determine what your duty is and you do that thing. And that may not be what maximizes happiness. So for example, if it turns out it's our duty to tell the truth, then whether Roberta would be hurt or not, I tell her the truth, right? If my husband comes to me in the morning and says, does this outfit look good? And it doesn't, then I say no, right? Because the idea isn't to maximize happiness. The idea is to figure out what's the moral law, what's the duty, what's the obligation I have, and do that thing. And so how you determine what your duty is in the Kantian system is very, I mean, you could take a class for an entire semester on Kantian ethics. So I'm going to simplify, right, as much as possible for us. How do you determine what your duty is? Well, the idea is that being rational creatures, we will understand what the moral law is and we will do that thing. So Kant had a strong confidence in human beings wanting to be rational all the time. And so if you're rational, you'll understand what your duty is and you will do that thing. So rational people will follow the moral law. And he thinks that when rational people think about what are the principles that should guide our action, they'll come up with a few what he called categorical imperatives. We're not going to go through all the categorical imperatives, but just a categorical imperative just means a rule that applies universally in all cases at all times. So that's what a categorical imperative is like. That's a rule that sticks all the time, as opposed to what they call hypothetical imperatives, which are hypothetical imperatives are principles that apply only in certain situations. Like if you want to get an A in your philosophy class, then you should really study and put time into your philosophy reading. But if you're not taking philosophy class, that principle doesn't apply to you, right? So that's an example of a hypothetical imperative. But the categorical imperatives apply to everyone across all times, all spaces, all everything. It's a universal principle. And so one example of his categorical imperatives is the idea that you would always act so that the principle behind your action could be made a universal law. So that sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple. So if I am thinking about the following principle, like I'm faced with, I made a promise to Roberta, and I'm trying to figure out if I can break my promise at all. And so I think about my principle, and my principle is going to be something like, I can break a promise when it's convenient for me. We've all met people with this kind of a principle before, I'm sure. If it's convenient for me to break a promise, I can break a promise. And then Kant says, well, could you will that to be the kind of principle that everyone acts on? Right? So now all of us are acting on the principle that we can break a promise when it's convenient for us. And what he says is, what you notice about that, once you make it a principle everyone can follow, is that the institution of promise making just totally breaks down, right? If we all know that there's a rule that we can break our promises when it's convenient to do it, why would anybody make promises or accept promises in the first place, right? Right? If I promise Grace that I'm going to pay her $20 back if she loans it to me today, but we live in a world where everyone can break promises when it's convenient for them, why would Grace even take that seriously? So the whole institution of promise breaking breaks down. So you can't will that principle to be universalized. And then you don't make an exception of yourself ever. If it can't be a principle that would function with if everyone followed that principle, then you don't get to do it. So now I don't break my promise to Roberta. Is that making sense so far? So it's not about the consequences for Kant, it's about the logic. When we universalize breaking promises because of fear of the consequences, or because it's convenient for us, then the institution breaks down and making a promise doesn't even have any meaning. So it just can't work that way. And then another tenet of Kant's, and this is the last one I'll do, is to never use another person as a mere means. Always treat them as an end in themselves. And that's sort of like one of the primary codes of Kantian ethics. And so I can't, for example, on Kantian ethics, say to Grace, hey, if you loan me $20, I'll pay you back, knowing that I will never pay Grace back. Because I will have used Grace as a mere means. I needed $20 and I had no respect for Grace's humanity, no respect for Grace as a person of, with will of their own or anything like that. And I will have just used Grace as a mere means to get my $20. And you don't get to do that in Kantian ethics, right? There's a duty not to use any other person as a mere means to your ends. You can use people as a partial means. Like if I go to the store and I have a transaction with the cashier at the store, that's fine because the cashier signed up to be a cashier, right? That's what they do for their job. I'm not using them. They're just a person who needs to do their job. But if I use one of you as a mere means, outside of sort of like professional things or something like that, then I've broken a moral duty. I can't do that on the Kantian view. So on that Kantian view, you do your duty and you follow that through. That's what being a moral person is. You determine what the moral law is and you do that thing. Even if it's going to hurt people, whether or not it makes them happy, doesn't matter. You apply the moral law, you do it. That's the end of the day. So who matters on that view? Who counts in that view? At the time when Kant was writing in the 19th century, only rational beings counted as morally considerable. If a being did not have the capacity for rational reflection, then they wouldn't count morally. In more recent times, there have been scholars, Kantian scholars, who have tried to find a way for the view to account for animals, but historically excluded anyone who's not rational, kept open the possibility that there could be like alien beings out there who have high cognitive skills and rationality, and they could count morally. But that was about it. All right, we're doing all right. Okay. So third view I'm going to talk about, also non-consequentialist, and that's virtue ethics. So virtue ethics comes to us from the ancient Greeks. And whereas utilitarianism, right, which is the view that you maximize happiness and minimize pain for all concerned, and Kantianism, where you do your duty, you follow the moral law, they both have like rules that you apply to all situations, kind of like a cookie cutter, right? You're in a moral dilemma of some kind, boom, you apply your principle, you get your answer, now you've been a moral person. The next two views I'm going to talk about do not work like that. So they do not work with principles that are in charge that you just kind of apply to everything. And virtue ethics is one of those kinds of theories. So it's not centered on principles, it's centered on virtues like generosity, courage, temperance, prudence, justice, those kinds of things. And so the idea is to learn to be a person of virtue, not just act like a person of virtue, but to be a person of virtue. And then in any given situation, you do what the virtuous thing is. So you ask yourself, what would it mean to be courageous in this situation? So say you're at work and something terrible is happening and you're trying to decide whether or not to bring attention to that, right? You would, instead of trying to figure out what would maximize happiness for all concerned or figure out what your duty is, you'd ask yourself, well, what would a courageous person do? What would a just person do? And then you have your answer, right? You try to, you be virtuous. So what would it mean, right, to be just in this situation or courageous? And this is a thing you learn over time by being around virtuous people, right? So from childhood, right, you hope that you're going to be surrounded by virtuous people who will give you good examples, and they'll be your moral education over time. And then you will become a virtuous person. And then this is one of my favorite parts of this theory is that because I always feel like it has a role for like the best friend, you go to the person of practical wisdom in your life. Like if you're not sure, if I don't know what the courageous thing to do is or what the generous thing to do is, then I go to a person in life who I take to be a person of virtue, a person of wisdom. And so I call Roberta and I say, Roberta, I don't know what to do, right? Then, right? And we think about it together because Roberta is wise and kind and thoughtful and just and all of these things. And so I know that she will be someone who I can think through, right, a problem with. So in general, what's virtuous is going to be what they call the mean between excess and deficiency. So again, this is actually very straightforward. Think about something like courage. So the virtue of courage is the mean, it's the middle point between cowardice, which is deficient to be a coward, and recklessness, which is excess. So if I'm on the battlefield, to use an example the Greeks loved, if I'm on the battlefield and I'm trying to figure out what's courageous, just running out by myself when I've dropped my sword and I have no other fellow soldiers around me is reckless. That's not courageous. Hiding behind a rock while everybody else fights, that's cowardice, I would imagine. And so courage is going to be somewhere between those two things. And it may depend on whether I have a weapon or I don't have a weapon, or whether other people around me are not. So there's not like a rule I can apply, right? What's courageous in a situation might shift depending on the facts on the ground a little bit, right? But the idea is to always aim for courage, always aim for the virtue. So should I break my promise is not going to be answered by a principle. right? Should I break my promise is not going to be answered by, is it my duty to always tell the truth? It's going to be answered by what it means to be virtuous in that situation. So I'll give you a quick example. When my husband's grandmother was on her deathbed, she was a Holocaust survivor, and it was like very important to her that the family continue. And at that time in my life, I was not planning on having children. And the woman's on her deathbed, and she grabs my hand and says, Karen, promise me you're going to have children. And I sat there knowing full well at the time that I had no intention of having children. And I thought, oh my goodness, what do I do now? Right? In the utilitarian world, I got to run a quick calculation, right? I have to figure out what's going to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. In the deontological Kantian world, I have to figure out what's my duty. My duty is usually to tell the truth, right? In the virtue world, I'm asking myself what a person who's generous, just, temperate, prudent, these kinds of things, what would that person do, right? What does a person do in that case? So in that case, I did lie. I did. Because taking the situation as a whole, I felt like that's what a generous person would do. But you can see that on the virtue theory, you're not applying a principle. You're figuring out what a person of virtue would do, right? And if you are a person of virtue, then you're just asking yourself, what do I do, right? As a virtuous person. All right, last one, I promise. I totally lied when I told. Oh, Carrie is asking, can you decide what virtues you want to follow? No, not on the original Greek system of virtue ethics. There are virtues that you are supposed to have. And if you don't have them, you've screwed up in some way. Yeah, it's not like a menu. You get to, right? You get to pick which virtues you want, which ones you don't. So they were pretty strict about which virtues you should have. That's a great question. Thank you. So finally, I'm going to come to care ethics, which you'll often hear of called feminist care ethics or feminist ethics. It goes by many names. It is a feminist theory. It came out of feminist schools of philosophical work. And what you'll notice about probably all the other views that we talked about is that there is no discussion of emotion or relationships in there. Because the general idea was that all ethical deliberation must be rational only. Because feelings really mess things up, right? This is the thinking. Also, as a feminist scholar, I feel beholden to say that these were also all theories that were brought together by men at times when the idea that emotions were entirely sort of connected to femininity and women. And that was considered not a thing you wanted attached to your theories, right? It would just muddy the waters. And so feminist theory comes in and says, hang on, everybody. There is a place for justice, and there is a place for duty and obligation, and there is a place for virtue. But there's also a place for love and for care and relationality. We are beings who are in relationship with one another. We're born dependent, we die dependent, we live dependent in between. And care is a moral practice among other things, right? And so feminist ethics came in and said, look, care is a part of moral deliberation. And what we need out of our ethical theories also is for them to be contextualized. So contextualized socially, politically, economically, because when we face moral dilemmas, we don't face them in a vacuum, right? So I'll give you another example to help make this clear. I am a vegetarian, and when my son was born prematurely, he was in intensive care. I did have it. So it turned out I didn't lie to my grandmother-in-law. I lied, but then I made right on it or something. I'm not really sure. But in any case, right? So I have this baby and he's in intensive care and I couldn't breastfeed him. And so he needed to eat. And the only baby formulas at that time were vegetarian, but not vegan. And so I had a choice I had to make, right, around how to feed my child. And feminist ethics is going to take into consideration the economic, social, political factors at play, including that there are reasons that there wasn't any vegan baby formula on the market. And that's because, right, the dairy industry and everybody else only makes baby formula that has animal products in it, right? So it limits my choices, I guess is what I'm getting at, right? And so when we're doing moral evaluation, we should think about what's limiting our choices, right? How is maybe capitalism, for example, limiting what an individual can do in any given situation? And so feminist care ethics is contextualized in that way. It wants to take the lay of the landscape into consideration and figuring out what we should do. And so justice and rules and principles has a role, but so does context and care and feelings and relationships. Like it might matter in a situation that I'm someone's mother. It might matter that you're someone's son. It might be ethically relevant to the situation. So in the feminist theory, right, the argument is often made that it's not possible to make moral decisions completely impartially. And even if it were possible, it wouldn't be desirable. Like we wouldn't want moral people making decisions with no affect involved of any kind. And so you end up sort of approaching situations very contextually. And then it's often very kind of pluralist in its approach, right? So some feminist ethicists rely more on utilitarian reasoning, some more on virtue, some more on Kantianism, and some a kind of like complicated soup of all of them, a pluralist approach, where you might use some kind of principle and then take other considerations into consideration in a different situation or whatnot. So it's a little bit more piecemeal, I guess, but not in an uncooked way, like in a more of just it's more pluralist. You have more, you can pull from a multitude of resources.